Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our StockSense Biosecurity webinar this evening. My name's Tegan Brammer, and I'm the project manager for the StockSense project. So tonight we have a couple of great speakers, and I hope you all learn a lot and get a lot out of tonight. Firstly, StockSense is a project run by the Victorian Farmers Federation. We're funded by the Cattle Compensation Fund and the Sheep and Goat Compensation Fund. And this project's aim is to help raise awareness and improve best practice livestock health, welfare and biosecurity for Victorian livestock producers. So we do this through running a number of events throughout the year. We run educational workshops, face-to-face workshops. We also run webinars, as well as our resources, which you can find on our website. We hand these out at our events, and we have a number of peri-urban resources as well. Just a bit of a snapshot of what we've got coming up next. Next Wednesday, we'll have a cattle webinar, and then we'll have a heading to Euroa for our cattle workshop. And then we'll start a series of peri-urban workshops, which are aimed at smaller landholders. So this is the project, and we're really keen to hear about your feedback. At the end of this webinar, there'll be a survey. We'd really appreciate if you could take a couple of minutes to complete that. We'll also, throughout this webinar, have the Q&A function open. So if you've got any questions for the presenters, please put those in the Q&A function, and we'll answer those after each presentation. And as I mentioned, if you'd like any information or resources, feel free to get in touch through our email or through our social media. So tonight, first up, we have Dr Joan Lloyd talking about biosecurity planning and identifying risks on your farm. And then we'll have Dr Jeff Cave speaking about foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease and giving a bit of an update. So first up, we have Dr Joan Lloyd. She completed her Doctor of Veterinary Medicine in Canada before emigrating to Australia and completing postgraduate study at the University of Sydney. She's managed and conducted research on an extensive range of infectious diseases of farm animals, and established her consultancy business in 2008, has over 37 years of veterinary experience. So thank you, Joan. I'll stop sharing and leave it to you. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I was still on mute, so I hope everybody can hear me now. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to Tegan, and thank you to I don't do very many Zoom webinars, so I'm sorry about that. Just figuring out the technical things at this end. I'd like to thank Victorian Farmers Federation and StockSense for asking me to give this presentation tonight, where I'll be talking a bit about biosecurity planning and some of my thoughts around practical application of the biosecurity plan. We hear a lot about biosecurity planning and the need for every farm to have a biosecurity plan, especially over the past 12 months with the things that have gone around happening on Australia's doorstep. But what I'd like to do tonight is talk, maybe take a step back from that and talk a bit about biosecurity planning and how it is a part of the overall flock and herd health plan. And so this might be a little bit different from how you've heard it spoken about before. But I'll just initially, before I get into biosecurity planning, talk a bit about the flock and herd health plan, what it is, and who should have one. And then we'll work through some questions around putting the biosecurity part of the plan to work. So essentially, the flock or herd health plan is just a plan for how you're going to manage or prevent the diseases of greatest concern for the flock or herd. And whenever we use animals for food or fiber production, I believe that we have a moral responsibility for making sure that they're healthy and well cared for. And to enable us to do that effectively, it really helps to have a plan about how we're going to manage the health of the animals on our farm. And so as part of the flock or herd health plan, we need to think about identify diseases or conditions of risk for the animals on the farm. And in doing that, we need to think about how each disease of concern is transmitted, because that helps us think about how we're going to manage and prevent and control disease on the farm. That helps us identify possible areas of risk. And for different farms, risk will be different. So the risk for a essentially closed, self-replacing merino flock will be different to, for example, a feedlot or a farm that trades in animals. So the plan is specific to the farm, and it allows you to, as I say, to identify these areas of concern and ways of areas of risk. And then once you've identified those areas of risk, the management systems you can put in place to reduce risk. And so I hope you can, by that initial introduction, you can see how everybody that has livestock really needs to have a flock or herd health plan. So what comprises a plan? And I think I have 9 parts to the plan. I think if you spoke to a number of different veterinarians, some would say there are 10, others would say there are 12, but I've come up with these 9. So the first is a biosecurity plan, and we're going to talk or work through some examples of that after this. And the biosecurity plan is really about how you're going to keep the diseases that aren't on the farm out. And to be able to do that effectively, you need to know which diseases you already have on the farm. Because if you already have that disease, it doesn't make a lot of sense for putting lots of effort into keeping that disease out. What you need to be doing is putting your effort into how the animals on the farm are going to be protected from, for example, through vaccination, or treated for that particular disease if there's an outbreak. Every farm should have a parasite control plan, and this is an essential part of farming livestock in Australia. Australia is a place where there can be quite significant parasite challenge, and the parasite challenge varies around Australia. In some parts of Australia, it's more external parasites. In some, it's more internal parasites. For example, worms. In some parts of Australia, fluke are an issue. So as part of the flock or herd health plan, every livestock enterprise should have a solid parasite control plan. There needs to be a plan around how the animals will have their feet looked after, and this is more this varies from where you are and also the animals that you're running. So sheep and goats tend to require more foot care than cattle, but still it's an important part of looking after cattle. There needs to be a mastitis action plan, because you don't want to be scrambling. If you have a problem with mastitis, you need a plan of how you're going to handle that in advance. There need to be protocols for if animals need to be put down in emergency, how that's going to be done. Protocols around calf, kid, and lamb rearing. And then some record sheets that will be easy for you to use, because the thing about keeping records is that the easier it is to use your recording system, the more likely it is that you'll use it. So you can see that the biosecurity plan is only one part of the overall plan of how you're going to look after the health and well-being of the animals on the farm. But it is a very important part. And so what I want to do now is just run through what I do with my clients when we're first talking around biosecurity planning. It can be a little bit overwhelming to think about what you'll do, and there's lots of different templates that you can access online. So through LPA, the Farm Biosecurity Network website, and also I'm sure that you can contact Victorian Farmers Federation. So Tegan and her team, they have templates that you can use. But sometimes just thinking about those templates or filling out a template can be overwhelming, or you've done the template and then you think, well, I've done the template, well, what next? How do I apply that on a day-to-day basis? So what I'd like to do is just run through some questions that I use, and I've arranged these in particular order. So, and it's around questions that I think you need to, or we can all ask ourselves, whether we're doing these things. And these are the sort of the essential parts of the biosecurity plan. It's just a different way of thinking about it. And the idea is you answer either yes or no. And if you have answered no, then what actions you could maybe do so that the next time you look at this, you can answer yes. So the first thing to ask yourself is to ask, do I buy healthy animals from established herds or flocks that have a known health history? Do I maintain a closed flock or herd and use only AI or embryo transfer to introduce genetics? Now, this won't apply to every situation and every flock or herd. If your business is a trading business, then this isn't really applicable. But there are other things that you can do to try and minimize your risk. If you are in this situation where you have a closed herd and flock, you can ask yourself, do I source semen and embryos from donors certified free of infectious disease? So if you do buy animals, and we had a question on the previous slide about from healthy flocks. So building on that, you can ask yourself, do I buy animals from herds and flocks that are part of official disease control programs? So there are different official disease control programs for different species. So for sheep, there are things like the Johne's disease map. If you're buying rams, the Brucella ovis disease control programs. In goats, the programs, the Johne's disease map and the caprine arthritis encephalitis map. In cattle, again, Johne's disease, but depending on the part of Australia that you're in. So this is a way to protect yourself if you don't have those particular diseases. If you're buying animals, you can ask yourself, or do you visit the farm you're sourcing the animals from, have a look at the animals, and ask questions about health problems, things like abortions, mastitis, chronic wasting, diarrhea, lameness, or pneumonia. And if you do go and look at the animals, do you reject any animals with obvious defects or health problems? This seems like a really simple thing, but I'm sometimes surprised that people still buy animals like this. It depends on your business model, but if you're doing that, then certainly that puts you at greatly increased risk if you're buying animals that have obvious problems. More questions around sourcing animals. So you see, this is all still, we're at the sourcing of the animals. Do you ask for a fully completed animal health declaration? I check the vaccination and deworming status of the animals. And this is important because you need to see whether the animals are meeting your own farm vaccination and deworming protocols. Remember, when we were speaking about the overall herd and flock health plan, one of the things was about how we are going to manage and prevent the diseases that we already have on the farm. And so we need to make sure that animals that we bring in have been vaccinated to our disease control protocols and they've been dewormed. Depending on the animals that you're buying and your enterprise and the level of risk that you're prepared to take, sometimes you might have your veterinarian examine the animals that you intend to buy. And you might consider specific or tests for specific diseases in consultation with your vet to make sure that you don't bring in some of the diseases, particularly the ones that are, that are difficult to eradicate and get rid of once you have them on the farm. So these are things like Johne's disease, some of the mycoplasma diseases. There's a range of these diseases where if you have them on, introduce them, it can be a challenge then to get rid of them. So those slides were all about sourcing of animals, and that's a really important part of the biosecurity plan. And if you look at the templates for biosecurity planning, certainly there are a lot of questions, or a lot of parts of those plans are around sourcing animals, making sure you've got animals that are come as disease free as possible. So once you've made the decision and you've selected the animals that you're going to buy, the next challenge in terms of biosecurity is how are you going to get those animals from where you bought them to your farm? And there's a couple of, or a few things that I think you need to ask yourself around this. And the first is how you're going to bring those animals. So do you transport the animals yourself? And if you do that, do you transport them in a cleaned, disinfected vehicle? If you aren't transporting the animals yourself and you're using an external contractor, then there's a couple of things that you need to take consideration of here. So if you're using an external contractor, are the animals mixed with other animals on the truck? Or are your animals coming as a specific consignment? And you also need to consider and ask questions of the contractor in terms of where they've been and what they've previously had on the truck, and importantly, around their cleaning and disinfection. So now we've spoken about the source of the animals and then how they're going to be transported from where you bought them to your farm. So the next little bit of questions that I've put together are around what you're going to do with the animals when they first arrive. And really, it's really all new animals do need to be quarantined. This is to protect the health of the animals already on your farm. But it's also easier for the new animals that have come to the farm. They need time to adjust, to recover from the journey, to get used to their new environment. And it puts undue stress on them if they're immediately turned out with animals that you already have. So quarantining them has a two-pronged sort of, or it is two reasons why you do it. So do you quarantine drench the animals on arrival? Regardless, you've already checked their deworming status, but quarantine drenching the animals, then holding them on a surface where you can collect the manure, and so that that's not just washed out into your paddocks is ideal. You've checked the vaccination records as part of purchasing the animals. So while they're in quarantine, do you vaccinate them all so that they meet your vaccination protocols? It's a good thing to check and trim the feet of all the animals as required. You want to check to make sure they don't have foot rot, and you also need to trim them if that's needed. And then while the animals are in quarantine, they need to be regularly observed for disease. They should be in the quarantine for at least 28 days. Normally we say 4 to 6 weeks. If you can do it for longer than 28 days, that's good. You need to observe them for signs of disease. Because they're being transported to the new property is stressful for the animals. If they're carrying some sort of underlying disease, then it is possible that they will express that during the quarantine period. So you need to have them quarantined away from other animals, ideally in a double fenced paddock with a 3-meter separation, but just the idea is some sort of physical barrier between the new animals and the animals that are already on the farm. You should be handling and feeding these new animals last after the existing stock. You need to give some consideration to your boots. So can you use a disinfectant foot bath, and so not walk through the manure of these animals in your boots and then immediately walk back onto the rest of the farm? And also you need to give some thoughts to what's going to happen to the manure that these animals will pass while they're in the quarantine period. The other thing about having the animals in quarantine, if they do have problems and come down with disease, then it's much easier to manage that situation if you've got them in a confined space, much more, or in a smaller paddock, much more difficult if they're in a very large paddock or mixed in with your existing animals. So then just a few other questions that maybe aren't really as related to bringing in new animals. So with the new animals, we've spoken about the source, how they're going to be transported, and then how you're going to quarantine them in that initial period to make sure they aren't carrying disease. Now I just want to cover off on a few other things that I think are important for biosecurity. Because these are other potential ways that disease can enter the farm. So first, if you're in an area where there's a problem with feral cats, do you have a feral cat control program? This is especially important with sheep and goats for the control of toxoplasma. So it's just something that I need to be aware of if you're in an area with a feral cat problem. If you're in an area that has a problem with feral pigs, then do you have a feral pig control program? This is important not only for the health of the animals, but for the environmental health of the farm. Pigs can do an incredible amount of environmental damage. So if you're in an area where feral pigs are a problem, then it's important to have a feral pig control program. Do you regularly deworm all the dogs on the farm? This is important for the control of hydatid. So we all know this, but need to make sure that this is being done. And also making sure that you don't let your dogs eat raw cattle, sheep, or goat brains, offal, or the products of abortion. So important in terms of brains for the transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, so things like BSE, and which Australia is fortunate to be free of. Important that the dogs don't have access to the brains of livestock. Also, not eating offal, important for disease control, and also the products of abortion. Best if the dogs aren't allowed to eat those. Other things that you need to think about is to consider the source of purchased feed, so you don't introduce diseases like Salmonella and Yersinia. So if you're buying in feed, best if it comes with a vendor declaration associated with the feed. The other potential for disease to get onto the farm is the source of water. And especially running water, you don't need to consider where the source of water for the animals, whether it's accessed by cattle, sheep, or goats upstream. And I had a client who had a really significant issue with this last spring, where there was a bit of flooding and there were animals upstream. And unfortunately, some of these bacterial diseases like Salmonella and Yersinia, which had never been a problem before, suddenly became a problem. And then I also remind my clients, once we've got to the end of all of this, because it can be a bit daunting, that we need to all remember to still be smiling after answering all the questions. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that I've been able to shed some light on the practical application of the biosecurity plan. I encourage everybody to have a biosecurity plan as part of your overall herd and flock health plan. A biosecurity plan is essentially a plan to protect your business. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joan. Yeah, it's great to listen to. It's really important to consider all aspects of your farming system. So it's great to walk through that step by step. There is a question here for you. I have a JBAS 8 for my biosecurity plan, but they're really struggling to get the required tri-annual testing for Yonis done this year, as their vet has retired and the blood testing lab just won't accept blood samples unless they're collected by a vet. So they're trying to get a new vet, but large animal vets are hard to find, as many of us know. And their original vet, and they use BioCheck, which was the cattle vets had developed that to do the biosecurity plan for the past 6 years. And they run a closed breeding herd. So after all those years and expense of paying for Yoni's blood testing in the initial 8 years in order to get JBAS 8, obviously they don't want to lose that rating. So their question is, if they collect their own blood samples, can they get the Yoni's testing done without a vet, or do they need to pay to travel for a vet to come from a big cattle area like Southwest Vic?
They do need to have a vet for the market assurance programs, the official disease accreditation programs. The samples do need to be collected by a veterinarian. There's essentially no way around that. So they will have to pay for the veterinarian to come and collect the samples.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so there's no other questions at the moment. Again, if you've got a question for either of the presenters, just pop it in the Q&A and we can come back to that at the end of the presentation. So Joan, I'll get you to stop sharing and we will move on to our next presentation. So we have Dr. Jeff Cave, who is a Senior Veterinary Officer with Agriculture Victoria, based up in the northern region of Victoria. So thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. I'll just get my screen to share, and I think that will be working now for you. Okay. Yeah, thanks very much, Tegan, and thanks also to all of the people who have joined us this evening to listen to this presentation. And part of the focus of this presentation is to talk about what the ways in which the situation has changed in the last 12 months, because certainly 12 months ago, as you all remember, there was plenty of interest and also plenty of concern that Australia could be facing an exotic disease threat. And a large amount of that interest and concern was because of what happened in Indonesia at around about this time last year, when in May of last year, foot and mouth disease came into the country, and in March of last year, lumpy skin disease came in. So it was that much closer to us when that happened. And at the time, there was some modelling that occurred that gave percentage risks of seeing an outbreak of either of those two diseases over the next 5 years. And so what I thought I would talk about, at least initially, is the current situation in Indonesia and indeed around the rest of the world, to see if anything see what changes, if any, have occurred in that time. So the current situation in Indonesia at the moment, looking at this map, is that in the islands of Java and Sumatra, and also in Sulawesi, there's active infection, and there's also some in Kalimantan. In terms of statistics, and I guess when you look at figures of cases from Indonesia, possibly the figures are a little bit rubbery. The quote of most recently being 610,000 cases of foot and mouth disease affecting 27 of 38 provinces. I think the geographical distribution of the disease we could feel fairly confident about. Possibly the case numbers, I would imagine that there would be some degree of underreporting. Another important thing that's happened in the last year is that Australia have provided 4 million doses of vaccine, foot and mouth disease vaccine, to the Indonesians, in addition to the vaccine that the Indonesians are using already. But that's the situation with Indonesia. But I think it's important to remember that foot and mouth disease for a large part of the world is an endemic disease. So when you look at this map, all of those countries that are shaded in grey, apart from perhaps Papua New Guinea, are all countries in which foot and mouth disease is an endemic disease. And those countries have had foot and mouth disease as an endemic problem all along. So those countries, you could say, have been a risk to Australia all along, and the presence of foot and mouth disease in Indonesia is just an additional risk. But certainly, Australia has been under threat from foot and mouth disease for a long time. When we look at the distribution of lumpy skin disease, you'll see there that it's on the islands of Sumatra and Java. As far as we know, not on the islands of Borneo or Sulawesi. And importantly for us, it appears not to have come across those eastern provinces, which are naturally closer to northwest Australia. And I think it would be fair to say that when we were giving presentations on foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, there was almost a feeling of inevitability 12 months ago that almost irrespective of what we did, it was going to be difficult to keep lumpy skin disease out of the country because of the threat of insects blowing across the Timor Sea into northwest Australia, going on to infect our cattle herds in northwest Australia. But a little bit of work that's been done in the last 12 months by AusVet has perhaps tempered that risk somewhat. And the modelling work that AusVet have done has worked on the assumption that for an individual animal to become infected with lumpy skin disease, it needs to be exposed almost simultaneously to 30 to 50 insects that are mechanically carrying the virus. And you would appreciate that the chance of that happening for those insects to blow the 800 kilometres across the Timor Sea and then land on an individual beast in northwest Australia is probably a reasonably rare event. And in fact, their modelling would suggest that it's a 1 in 14,000 year event. Even if their modelling or their assumptions are not quite correct, and that it would only take 3 to 5 insect vectors to introduce disease, that still becomes a 1 in 286 year event. So I think that this is, if anything, the good news story of tonight. That feeling of inevitability that lumpy skin disease was going to come into Australia by being blown across the Timor Sea is possibly not the foregone conclusion that we may have felt that it was 12 months ago. And so that leaves us with all of the other ways in which exotic disease agents could come into the country. And I think that headlines such as these have become all too familiar to us. So yeah, our border control is constantly being challenged with things, often illegally imported foodstuffs coming into the country that could very well be laden with viral particles such as foot and mouth disease, African swine fever, or indeed lumpy skin disease. And so it would be fair to say that Australia, we've had this situation where we're an island nation separated from the rest of the world, which has been a very good form of quarantine as long as we've been here. But unfortunately, as the global community becomes that much smaller, the biosecurity threats that we're facing in Australia are becoming that much more. So it would be fair to say that the biosecurity threat to Australia now is probably never been greater. So the question then is, well, what's Australia doing about that? And I've given a number of presentations where people will say, well, if border security were doing their job, we wouldn't have anything to worry about, which is a reasonable enough statement. The problem is it's probably not a reflection of reality, because there will always be attempts at circumventing our biosecurity. And so what this pictorial represents is that we can't just rely on border security to prevent an exotic disease agent from coming into the country. And probably the best form of biosecurity is to have this kind of multi-layered approach where the assumption is that, and it's a bit like a row of Swiss cheese, disease agent may get through some of those layers, but if enough layers are put up and the holes are small enough, that somewhere along the way, the disease agent will get stopped without it ever being introduced to our livestock. Unfortunately, we'll always have those non-compliant rats, as we have demonstrated there in the pictorial, who will possibly make some of those holes larger. Our border security, I guess their job is to try and make those holes as small as possible to reduce the chance of things coming in. But we're relying on more than just that to keep exotic disease agents out of the country. So I've spoken a little bit about foot and mouth disease and about lumpy skin disease, but it's interesting to note that over the last 12 months, there's been plenty of other activity of other exotic disease agents. And it's something that is always happening there in the background, and ways in which you can find out about what's happening in the rest of the world. Well, there are a couple. One is if you simply Google the words ProMed and then subscribe to their emailing list, what you'll receive is a regular update of the various exotic disease outbreaks that are happening around the world. And I always find that an interesting way to start my day, to see what's happening in the rest of the world. And there's often interesting stories that you'll find through ProMed. Also, the World Animal Health Information System is another way of seeing some of the latest outbreaks. But if I was to summarise what I've been reading on ProMed during the last 12 months, it's probably been dominated by one disease more than any other, and that's avian influenza. And over the last 12 months, highly pathogenic avian influenza has been an exotic disease which has affected every continent in the world other than Australia and Antarctica. And some countries have really suffered because of it, Japan being a good example. Another thing about avian influenza is that it's been affecting other species. And naturally, there's always that background fear of our next global pandemic, and possibly an influenza pandemic is not out of the realms of possibility. Also within Australia, we've had our own exotic incursions, and probably one of the more significant ones is that in the bee industry of varroa mite. So Australia has been the last significant sized country in the world not to have varroa mite, which in some ways has probably increased our risks of it coming in. And then unfortunately, and I'm trying to think of the month that it happened, but it was around about this time last year that varroa mite was detected in New South Wales. And as you'll see in that map of New South Wales, unfortunately, it had spread a little bit before it was detected. And for the last 12 months, New South Wales has been doing all that they can to try and eradicate the pest. And I really hope that they're successful, because for the bee industry, varroa mite, if it becomes endemic in Australia, will become quite a large burden, well, both for the bee industry and our horticultural industries. Another disease event that we've had in Australia over the last 12 months was one that came completely out of left field. And that was the outbreak of Japanese encephalitis that we saw through eastern and southeastern Australia, one which affected a number of our pig herds. And unfortunately, it also affected some humans, and it actually caused the mortality of some humans. So up until about this time last year, Japanese encephalitis had only been seen up in as far south as the Torres Strait. It had never been seen further south than that. And then, probably through a combination of water birds and mosquitoes and other hosts, it was a disease that was able to travel quite unexpectedly down to southeastern Australia. So I guess when you're dealing with biological systems, there's always the possibility that the unexpected can happen, and that was certainly the case with Japanese encephalitis. But just going back to the topic of foot and mouth disease, it's probably the best example that I can use. I'll ask the rhetorical question of where it might begin. And we've always seen the most likely way in which a foot and mouth disease outbreak to occur would be through the illegal feeding of meat, illegally imported meat with foot and mouth disease virus to pigs. And so that's really the reason that we've driven the message quite strongly of the importance of not feeding such meat to pigs, called prohibited pig feeding, because we've always seen that as being the most likely way that we would have an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, and indeed African swine fever as well. And this was the way in which the UK had its, that was the way that the outbreak of foot and mouth disease began in the UK back in 2001. Another possible way, it's not seen as quite the risk of swill feeding pigs, but it's certainly quite a risk nevertheless, is the example of a traveller going through one of these foot and mouth disease endemic countries. And I think that this photograph on the right is one that was taken in Nepal, in which foot and mouth disease is an endemic disease. And then for that traveller to come back into Australia with dirty footwear and dirty clothing, equipment, and then coming in contact with susceptible livestock and starting an outbreak of foot and mouth disease from there. So they're the two likely ways in which it may begin. And from there, I guess the question is, what would happen from there? And if foot and mouth disease entered Australia and it was unrecognised, and so I guess by saying unrecognised, it would unregulated at the beginning at least, when you consider the amount of livestock movements that happen in Australia in a short space of time, there's the very strong possibility that it could spread far and wide very quickly. And what this pictorial shows are all of the movements of sheep in a randomly selected week, sheep sale yard movements to be more precise. So what it doesn't show are all of the cattle sale yard transport movements. It also doesn't show all of the private movements of sheep or cattle. It doesn't show the movements of pigs either. And you could imagine that if all of those lines were superimposed in this, there would basically be lines going everywhere, all in a very short space of time. Unfortunately, another thing that it would never show are those movements which aren't registered on our database. And on day one of a foot and mouth disease outbreak, what we would really be looking for is an accurate database of recent livestock movements so that we've got some chance of getting in front of the outbreak. And that's probably the main reason or the main driver for having the requirement of timely updates of livestock movements within 2 days of them happening. The other thing that would happen if we were to have an outbreak of foot and mouth disease would be, we don't necessarily expect or assume that every one of these lines is carrying disease, but certainly any movements that were carrying disease are going to go on and cause a great deal of destruction, because it's a very infectious disease, and you could be sure that any livestock that are carrying the virus are going to introduce the disease to the property to where they're going. And so what would happen initially in a foot and mouth disease outbreak would be that there would be a 72-hour livestock standstill. And what that 72-hour livestock standstill is doing is basically buying us time to try and work out or redefine, or define at least, where the disease could possibly be. And then after that initial 72 hours period, as it becomes more apparent where the disease is likely to be, those areas in which disease is or likely to be would still have movement restrictions, but the rest of the country, the movement restrictions would steadily ease. So it's all stuff that you'd rather not think about. But I guess on the subject of things that you'd rather not think about, back in 2001, I had the experience of going to the UK back in April 2001. And at the time, I went to the northwest of England, to Cumbria, up in the northwest, and that was the worst affected part of the country at the peak of the outbreak. And on any given day in Cumbria, we were looking at 50 or 60 new infected properties each day. And most of the month that I spent in Cumbria, I spent looking at scenes like this. And in some ways, that whole month became a bit of a blur. And when I think of the numbers of livestock that were destroyed, the number of property owners who were affected by the outbreak, that's also difficult to reconcile. But there was one day during that month that still stands out in my memory. And that was a day when I went to a property in Scotland. It was owned by a 70-year-old man who had spent his life building an Ayrshire stud. And disease was diagnosed in his property. I arrived at the property on the morning that the slaughter team arrived, and basically spent that morning watching his livelihood get blown away. I never got to meet that man because he was inside at the time. He couldn't bear to be out looking to see what was happening to his herd. But I've often thought afterwards, what would have come of him? Because I'm sure, at 70, there was no way that he was going to be able to rebuild what he'd lost. And I often think that it was probably something that he would have never recovered from afterwards. So I guess when I talk about some of the rules and regulations, that they're largely there to try and prevent a similar thing happening here in Australia. And I hope, certainly in my lifetime anyway, that we don't see a foot and mouth disease outbreak in Australia. So I'll just, coming towards the end of my presentation now, I thought I'd very quickly touch on, and to wrap things up, I'd very quickly touch on animal health declaration forms, as much to say that when buying in livestock, they're a thing that, as Joan said, are recommended. But I think it's when you look at your own property's biosecurity plan, you can almost think of it in the same way as we look at it as Australia's biosecurity plan. So obviously a piece of paper isn't going to keep disease out of your own property, but you could probably think of that piece of paper and all of those other points that Joan was talking about as being the slices of cheese, which are hopefully going to keep pests, diseases, and weeds off your property. And I think with your biosecurity plan, hopefully everything that I've spoken about, keeping exotic diseases out, are something that never happens. But if nothing else, by keeping a good biosecurity plan for your own property, you may be able to keep some of those more endemic agents out and save yourself the problem of a new weed species or a drench-resistant parasite or something like that. And upon saying that, I think I'll finish off there. I think these slides will become available to you, and there are some links on this last slide which will take you to some of the things that I was talking about just now. Okay, thanks, Tegan.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, it's great to reiterate that biosecurity is everyone's responsibility, and the way we can help is by starting at our own farm and looking at what we can do to mitigate these risks. There doesn't appear to be any further questions. This webinar is recorded, so it will be available online, hopefully not too distant future. And if you'd like the slides, we're more than happy to send them through to you. As I mentioned at the start, we will have a survey question which should pop up, or a link to the survey which should pop up once I end the webinar. The link will also be emailed to you after this webinar, so please take a couple of minutes just to fill that out for us, and we really value your feedback. So once again, thank you to Joan and Jeff for your presentations, and everyone have a good evening. Thank you.